Well, the Oklahoma was commissioned in 1916. It actually served during World War I and escorted President Woodrow Wilson over to France after the end of the war, and again it brought him back. Oklahoma arrived off the coast of Spain in 1936 to pick up American citizens and refugees during the Civil War that Spain had had. Shortly after that, they went over to the Pacific and became part of the Pacific Fleet and served in Hawaii and just basically did training exercises until December 6, 1940, when they were stationed in Honolulu. Yes, I looked into George Naegle a little bit. He actually enlisted in the Navy in January 1940. He arrived to the Oklahoma later in the year. He made about $54 a month as an enlisted man. Related to his job specifically as a seaman first class, he would have been involved in upkeep of the ship, line handling, just general cleanliness, swabbing the decks and things like that. He would have done watch standing, just various duties that those guys would have performed. Also just living on board the ship. They had sports clubs, so he may have been involved in something like that, basketball or baseball teams. Those were very popular because the ships would usually play against one another. So the team from Arizona would play against the team from Oklahoma and things like that. It would have been absolute chaos on board Oklahoma as the first torpedoes slammed into the ship. Guys just running to their battle stations. A lot of guys were below decks when this happened. It had happened so early on in the morning, and Sundays are typically sort of a day of rest. They called it rope yarn Sundays. So guys had pretty much the day to themselves to sort of catch up on laundry and, you know, getting their uniforms together and things like that. So just for the attack to have occurred at that time was just a complete and utter shock. So these guys would have been scrambling to get to their general quarters stations or to man the guns. Unfortunately, once they arrived to the gunners, when they arrived to their guns, found that often that either there was no ammunition there or the firing pins and things like that weren't in place, so they were unable to even fire back at the Japanese. A lot of the men had to jump overboard into the water, which at that point, due to the flames and fires and everything, had become pretty superheated. So they're jumping into almost boiling hot water. A lot of the guys had scrambled on board to the USS Maryland, which was docked next to them. Oklahoma was on the outboard side of the Maryland, so a lot of men jumped over to the Maryland and also took up gunnery positions because the Maryland sailors had been able to get their guns up. A lot of men, a lot of sailors and Marines were trapped below decks. I think it was 32 that actually were brought out a couple days after the attack. They had been banging on the bottom of the ship to get the attention of dockyard workers and other sailors that came and brought torches and things like that to get them out of the ship. Oklahoma was hit early on in the attack by 3 torpedoes from Japanese torpedo bomber planes. As it started to sink, it began to roll over, and as it did so, it was hit by 2 more torpedoes. Essentially, it rolled over, so the ship was essentially upside down at that point. The only reason it stopped was because its mast had hit the bottom of the ocean bed, and it trapped a lot of men below decks. 429 sailors and Marines were killed on board. Well, what had happened was Oklahoma was getting ready for an inspection on Monday, December 8th. So a lot of the doors and the hatches were open. So that didn't help watertight integrity. So when the first torpedo slammed into the ship, there was a mad scramble. Guys were trying to go to their general quarters, battle stations. A lot of guys were dogging down the hatches on the doors, and it just happened pretty quickly. All told, it probably took about 12 minutes for the Oklahoma to actually start to sink. Well, technology has come a long way, especially with DNA. I'd say that's probably the biggest, one of the biggest technological advances. There were so many, especially of the Oklahoma sailors and Marines that had been killed. They went unidentified for decades. It's only now that they've actually begun to identify a lot of these remains. These guys were buried in mass graves, and they were exhumed, and just now they're starting to identify the remains. Personal story, my wife's great uncle was a Marine killed on board Oklahoma, and he is still yet to be identified. So his family never had that closure, his mother, father, brothers and sisters. So that's very painful for a family to experience. So I can only imagine the joy my father-in-law and my wife will feel when he's finally identified. I believe right now there have been over 206 cases of remains identified by the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency in Honolulu. So.